Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W, our continuing discussion of American cultural history and culture in the 1950s. In our previous lectures, we've talked about the culture of consensus in the years after World War II. And in this series of lectures, we're going to talk about a countercurrent that ran through American culture in this era, which ran counter to that idea of consensus. In this lecture, we're going to focus on that counterculture in the realm of film. While the culture of consensus dominated American culture in the post-war years, guerrilla culture flourished on the social margins. Such things as radio thriller dramas, film noir, pulp fiction, comic books, comedy, and music. Generally, the post-war era was happy and content, but there was a strong undercurrent of worry and concern. Such things as nuclear weapons, families and rising divorce rates, children and juvenile delinquency, all created cause for concern in American society. American values also at times seemed contradictory in these times. The myth of the rugged individual clashed with the ideal of the close-knit community. Technology and progress competed with nostalgia for the good old days. Relaxation and fun seemed at odds with traditional work ethic. So there were feelings of a world turned upside down, full of menace, which dominated a noir mediascape, including films, books, comic books, and so on. In radio and movies, there was a turn towards horror. It evolved out of dime store paperback crime novels dating back to the 1930s. Pulp fiction featured corruption, betrayal, violence, and greed. Weary, disillusioned detectives like Sam Spade never seemed to find any real comfort in the justice system. This somber viewpoint was evident in several popular radio programs of the wartime era. Inner Sanctum started in 1941, and Suspense in 1942. They inspired dozens of other similar thriller dramas. Suspense depicted a world filled with troubles. It especially preyed on the fears of women, and often had plots involving women put in awful situations in their homes. One famous episode, called Sorry, Wrong Number, first aired on May 25, 1943. In the story, a woman who's an invalid discovers that her husband has hired someone to kill her. She seeks help by calling on the phone, but no one believes her. In the end, the killer stabs her to death, then says, "Sorry, wrong number," before hanging up the phone. There were also stories of men, particularly disgruntled employees, murdering their coworkers or their boss. This thread of darkness, fear, and the macabre also had its counterpart in film. Such movies came to be called film noir for their dark settings, grim mood, and somber subjects, derived from the French term called black film. There were themes of problems, alienation, anxiety, failure, and depravity. Such things had their roots in World War II. While often considered the quote-unquote good war, much about World War II left lasting scars. Thousands of veterans returned with physical and emotional damage. Relationships suffered. The job market in the post-war years was chaotic and difficult, and the reality of the nuclear bomb struck many. Film noir probed these and other anxieties. As one critic said, these were movies about adults, made for adults who had just been through a war. Film noir grew out of the so-called B-movie industry, which dated back to the Depression years. Studios had taken to showing double features to attract customers. There would be the main feature and the B-movie. While main features recorded gate receipts and the movie producers kept a percentage of the gate, B-movies were simply bought at a flat rate. Thus, makers of B-movies didn't rely on huge audiences or critical reception. They felt less restraint in their movie making. Film noir revolved around darkness, danger, and death, and common themes were fear, alienation, and claustrophobia. It's not always easy to draw a line around the edges of film noir, as it bled into a variety of different genres, and at times even A-level movies could be considered film noir. And while many of the noir films were set in the dark and gritty urban settings, others of them took place in small towns or suburbs. And they crossed a variety of different popular genres, from the police procedural, and we think about the private eye films of that era, to gangster movies, to other kinds of thrillers, to just household dramas in some cases. Another common theme in these movies was the fact that many of them centered on women of questionable virtue, and women featured prominently in many of the noir films. This led to a later trend that has sometimes been known as bad girl movies, in which such women feature prominently in the plot. The titles alone of many of these films indicate the kinds of themes and plot lines involved. Titles include Framed, Abandoned, Cornered, Desperate, The Hunted, Raw Deal, Quicksand, No Escape, and The Night Holds Terror. Also, the prominence of violence in these films is featured in the titles as well. The Killer That Stalked, Murder Without Tears, Paid to Kill, and so on. At times, noir films bridged over into A-list productions, like The Maltese Falcon, which was directed by John Huston and starred Humphrey Bogart. The Maltese Falcon created many of what would today be considered cliches of the police procedural type film. But The Maltese Falcon was the originator of those cliches, and it is considered by some the finest film ever made. Perhaps the most famous director of noir films was Alfred Hitchcock, who was one of the top movie makers of the 50s and 60s. His films number many and include some of the greats of all time, including Strangers on a Train from 1951, Rear Window from 1954, Vertigo in 1958, and North by Northwest in 1959. And they also include other films in the 60s and later, including Psycho in 1960, The Birds in 1963, and Frenzy in 1972. One of the classics of the noir genre is 1945's Detour, directed by Edgar G. Ulmer. It includes all the great ingredients of classic noir films: darkness, fear, murder, death, mistaken identity, and running from the law, along with a powerful female lead throughout the film. Produced at a very low budget, it also was one of the greatest money makers of its day, and has been retired as one of the most influential films of its era. In the next lecture, we will further examine the counterculture of the 1950s as it ran through literature and writing of the era.